Credit card offers. Are you thinking about applying for a credit card or are receiving pre-approved credit card offers in the mail? Before you sign up, here are a few items to consider. Understand you are signing a contract. Credit cards come with a card member agreement. It is important that you read and understand all of the terms in the agreement before you apply. If you don't pay off your monthly balances, you will have a loan that has to be paid back according to the terms you agreed to. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau maintains a searchable database of credit card agreements for hundreds of credit card companies. Visit www.consumerfinance.gov/creditcards. Check it out and compare a few agreements before you make your final decision. You can also contact the credit card company and request a copy of the agreement if you don't have one. Determine your needs. Find the credit card that is best for you. Many credit card companies offer promotions or rewards such as cash back, free airline miles, or other travel discounts. If you travel a lot, that could be helpful, but if you don't, you may never use those rewards. Realize that many of these rewards can come at a cost, like an annual membership fee. Think about the type of credit card that best fits your needs, and then shop around. Do your research. Make sure you read the fine print and disclosures related to annual fees, transaction fees, interest rates, finance charges, and credit limits. Check when payments will be due and if there are any grace periods. In some cases, credit card companies offer new introductory rates that increase over time. Avoid costly surprises by reading and understanding the terms of the credit card agreement. Also look for what services are provided. Does the company have 24-hour customer service phone number? What security members and fraud protections does the company provide? Lastly, protect yourself. Unless you are actually looking for a credit card, stop pre-approved credit card offers. These are easy to spot in your mailbox and can be used by identity thieves to get a credit card in your name. Scammers can also use the unsolicited pre-approved credit card offers to trick you into giving up sensitive information. The scammer uses this information to steal your identity and commit additional fraud. You can have your name removed from the credit card marketing list by calling toll-free 888-567-8688 or visiting the OptOut website at www.optoutprescreen.com. So before you sign that first credit card application, do a little research to help ensure that you select the credit card that's right for you, with the terms you understand and agree to, and the services that help protect your financial information and identity. Enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media. More resources are available on the Consumer Protection 101 webpage at www.datcp.wi.gov.